I'm Jay Hein. It's good to be back with you. I'd like to introduce Richard Crespin, who is with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Mary made mention to Mark Dobosh, who isn't here. Some of you, though, have worked with him in the past. Mark represents one of our strategic partners, SCORE. Hopefully you work with SCORE in your communities. It's one of the very few organizations in America that is wholly and magnificently dedicated to capacity building. That's all they do, is build skills and use retired executives to come alongside you for business strategy and strategic plans and other capacity building services. SCORE, in partnership with the Office Depot Foundation, has produced a book that hopefully is in your packets. If not, let us know. We'll get you one that is a terrific workbook for self-reflection on your organization and some terrific ideas about how to build your capacity. So SCORE has been a partner in this effort from the early days, and so has the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. You'll meet Stephen Jordan or re-meet him, become reacquainted with him in just a few moments. Stephen stood up the Business Civic Leadership Center at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is a long way of saying the corporate social responsibility arm or the corporate citizenship arm of the Chamber. But that's a service organization, so it's really coming alongside America's businesses, like Office Depot and Office Depot Foundation, to be able to serve their mission and their communities more effectively. And Richard is now leading the capacity building portfolio at the BCLC on behalf of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So the U.S. Chamber, like SCORE, has been a partner with Mary and the Office Depot Foundation. Now, Richard's going to share with us some insights from his desk at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. After his presentation, we're going to be highly interactive up here. And again, get your thoughts and really, really good questions ready, and we'll get you in the conversation as well. Richard?
Thanks, Jay. I am Richard Crespin, and I am a senior fellow with the Business Civic Leadership Center. And I am privileged every morning to wake up and work on my life's passion, which is all about helping companies and nonprofits work better together to solve the tough problems that we face as a society. And what I want to do, just to set a little bit of context for our conversation, is share with you a couple of insights that I've picked up about the science of management and about the management of innovation. And hopefully take a couple of the concepts that we heard yesterday and develop those into frameworks that you can utilize back in your offices. How many people know who this is? Anybody? This is Alfred P. Sloan. Sloan was the chairman and CEO of the General Motors Corporation, and under Sloan's management, General Motors became the largest corporation in the entire world. Sloan was an engineer by training. He went to MIT, and he looked at the world as a series of problems and processes, systems and puzzles, and he developed a reputation for being something of a cold, calculating, and callous man. But he also had a very big heart for philanthropy. Sloan endowed many institutions, including the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation and the School of Management at MIT that bears his name to this day. And I think it's significant that Sloan chose to endow a school of management at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology instead of a school of business at any other institution. He did it because Sloan believed in the science of management. He believed that it was a science that could be applied to any field of endeavor and shouldn't just be limited to business. Now, we in the civil sector have been told for years that we should emulate businesses. And I agree, but I think that we should emulate different things than what we've been emulating up until this point. And I want to share three specific things that I think we should emulate differently. Number one, the things that we measure. Number two, the way that we deploy talent. And number three, how we go about systematically creating innovation within our organizations. Now, Sloan didn't coin the phrase, you can't manage what you can't measure, but he could have. He loved to measure things. He loved to count things. And a lot of what we think of today as modern American management culture, we owe to Sloan. It was bequeathed to us by Sloan and his successors. But what I realized over the last few years is that as we've tried to take on emulating businesses and what they measure, we've taken on the things that even businesses don't like to measure. Audits, reporting, efficiency studies, overhead ratios. I don't know a single person in the private sector who wakes up in the morning and goes, woohoo, tomorrow's the audit. The audit is going to show me the true value and impact of my business. Nobody says that. Nobody says that.
What?
In fact, what an audit reveals is less than 20% of the value of a publicly traded company. The book value of a company is less than 20% of the value of the company. The real majority, 80%, of the shareholder value is contained on the balance sheet in line items called intangibles: brand, corporate reputation, goodwill. Notice I didn't say unmeasurable. I said intangible. They're not easily measured. You can't touch and feel them, but they are measurable. Somebody measured them. An accountant signed off on them. They're on the balance sheet. They can be measured, but they're intangible. So how do we go about measuring our impact? That was what we all talked about yesterday. Well, there is a phenomenon that people observed in World War I pilots. So you have to remember back in World War I when they were training pilots, they would train them, because there weren't airstrips, there weren't air bases, they would train them to land in big open fields like this one. But what they started to see is that a significant portion of people, rather than landing in the big open part of the field, would actually end up hitting the tree. Like, why would they hit the tree? Well, their brains would focus in so much on what they weren't supposed to do that they ended up doing it anyway. Don't hit the tree, don't hit the tree, don't hit the tree. Crash! You hit the tree. Don't make a profit, don't make a profit, don't make a profit. Well, you didn't make a profit. Well, congratulations, you didn't make a profit. That's a tax status, that's not a goal. I have a dream. I have a dream, and my dream goes by the very compelling term, return on marginal investment. I know that this is almost exciting as Dr. King's dream, and I know that you're ready to follow me into battle in pursuit of return on marginal investment. But return on marginal investment is an important thing, and it's a very complicated way of saying something very simple, which is that I want you as executives, me as a funder, other stakeholders, to be able to evaluate the marginal investment in one project versus that of another. I want to be able to say that giving you $1 to solve your problem is going to return a greater value than if I give $1 to her. I want to know that that dollar is going to feed more children than that dollar. That dollar is going to save more lives than that dollar. And that's how we need to kind of rethink the way that we approach measurement. I don't know exactly what that looks like within your organization, but it's a shift from a book value mentality of measurement to an asset-based and balance sheet mentality. Thinking about how you can measure return on marginal investment. Return on investment in the private sector is calculated as a ratio. Profit divided by expense. We don't have profit, we have impact. So what we need to do is divide impact by expense. And you need to be able to project and make predictions about the relative investment and the relative return of one project versus another. There's actually a whole field of management science on this called portfolio management. And companies do exactly this. They try to manage projects within their company in the same way that they would manage stocks within a portfolio. Now, you're going to say, I don't know how to measure it, I can't predict it, I can't rely on those predictions. You can't, and neither can they. All those disclosure statements that come from your stockbroker on a mutual fund prospectus, those are all disclosure statements telling you that you can't rely on what he tells you the projected return on marginal investment will be. But that doesn't stop them from going through the science of trying to evaluate it. And that, I think, is one thing that you need to think about, is to think about how you can change your mindset into one of calculating that. How do you do that tomorrow? Again, I don't know exactly, but I have another idea, and it comes back to my point about how do we differently deploy talent within our organizations. Right now, most nonprofits use volunteers at the top or at the bottom. We put them on our boards, or we ask them to come in and bang nails. Where we really need them is in the middle and upper middle ranks of management. We need them to come in and embed with us for a long period of time and bring their private sector expertise. Not to copy what they do in the private sector, but to bring their private sector eyes to our civil sector problems. We need them to come in as operations managers, as financial managers, as supply chain managers, as IT managers, as CIOs and COOs and CFOs, and bring that management science, that measurement science, and ask them to help us solve this problem of how do we measure our impact. Not to directly copy what they're doing, but to use their science for our problems. The second thing we need to do is we need to have some courage. I was talking with Erin from Feed the Children yesterday, and she was telling me when volunteers come in, we turn ourselves inside out to try to find things for them to do. Instead, we need to think about and be brave enough and be adult enough to treat them like adults, particularly when we're in long-term relationships with a corporation, to better articulate our needs. We don't need to be able to tell them from 9 to 3 on Tuesday, I need you to do this, this, and this. But we need to be able to tell them where we need your help is in finance, we need your help in operations, we need your help in supply chain, and we need you to send us talent like that to help us work on those problems. Then the last thing we need to do is figure out how to use innovation differently and to think about it in a systemic way. I loved what Lindsay had to say yesterday at GuideStar about these Yelp-like systems that allow people to rate your organization. Great if you get positive feedback. What do you do with the negative feedback? The real question is, how do you take that data and turn it into something that you can use to repeatedly change the way that you operate, and that you focus it not on not making a profit, but that you focus it on how, and not on just this broad horizon of your mission, but on the narrow path of return on marginal investment on each individual project. The other thing that we're going to need to do is we're going to need to think about how we take and gather long-term data. Many of us work in fields like health, homelessness, literacy, where the impact is distant. It will take multiple years to measure that impact. We need longitudinal studies. Do you know who's really good at longitudinal studies? Academics. Do you know who loves the civil sector? Students. These people at your local business schools, your local graduate schools, they want to help you. They want your data. Why do they want their data? Because they want to get published. You have little laboratories that they want to come and study so that they can gather data and publish it. They're willing to do it for free if you're willing to ask them and articulate what your impact and how you're trying to measure it. Lastly, and this has to do with how do we systematically improve. It goes to one of the things that the What If guys were talking about yesterday. When you look at, and people who study innovation will tell you that when you're looking for dramatic improvements, 10, 30, 50x, 100x improvements in a field, those never come from people who are steeped in the field. If you're in that river, that fast-flowing river of deep expertise, you can't see outside the river, and what you get is incremental improvement. Vast improvements come from outliers or from people who are living at the intersection of multiple disciplines, not on these islands of talent, but in the intersection points. And when you bring in those skills-based volunteers that I talked about before, you're creating a repeatable way of bringing together multiple disciplines to work on a particular problem. The government has an actual program that the president introduced a few years ago called the Presidential Innovation Fellows. And in this program, people from the private sector at the junior executive level come in and they embed in the government for up to a year, and they work. They bring their private sector eyes to public sector problems. They don't try to copy the private sector or make the public sector be like the private sector, but they try to bring those private sector eyes to public sector problems. You can create similar innovation fellowship programs within your own organizations. In fact, GuideStar has done exactly that. You can Google the President's program, or I'm sure the GuideStar people would be happy to tell you about their program. But you want to create ways of repeatedly bringing together this innovation. The last thing I'll talk about is about how we engage with corporations, particularly around philanthropy. How many people here raise money from corporations? Okay, put your hands down. Now be honest, because I'm going to ask you questions about this later. How many of you have read the corporate social responsibility reports of the organizations that you're raising money from? How many? Keep your hands up if you've also read the annual report. That's tremendous. This is even more than I would have expected to see. Perhaps the biggest sea change in corporate philanthropy in the last 10 years has been this idea of shared value. If you haven't read Michael Porter's essay on shared value, you need to read it. Basically, what Porter is telling us is that corporations, if they're going to engage in philanthropy and social responsibility and sustainability, those efforts need to align with the long-term business strategy of the organization. Those don't need to pay off immediately. They don't even have to work. But those investments have to show how they are aligned with the long-term business strategy of the organization. And what they're doing in these CSR reports and in these annual reports is they are telegraphing to you what their strategy is. And if you can align with it, you'll be much better off than if you're not aligned with it. The very last thing I'll say before we go into our conversation is that the other thing that we need to do for ourselves as a civil sector is be patient with ourselves. The double entry accounting system, which governs how people measure things in the private sector, was invented in the 15th century. It's over 600 years old. They've had a lot of time to think about how to measure their impact and how to calculate all of these things. We don't have 600 years. We won't need 600 years. But it is going to take us some time, and we should be patient with ourselves, and we should be willing to channel our inner Alfred P. Sloan to be measurers, to be managers, but to also let ourselves fail, to let ourselves take risk. And if we get it right 51% of the time, we're not doing half bad. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Richard, let's spend a little bit of time interacting with Richard before we move into the sort of wider angle view, because that was terrific. Thank you very much. But you also laid a lot on us, and you used some really big words. And so I'd like to unpack them a little bit, which is, let's start with measurement, using your sequence. Return on marginal investment. Could you talk about each of those 5 words and what they mean? In effect, what I mean is, could you unpack a little bit your thinking behind it? Because we do know how to measure operating income. Did you spend more than you brought in? That rolls pretty nicely into auditing reports and accounting statements, and yet that isn't done well oftentimes between the executive director and the board and others. But that's double entry accounting, long tail financials. You're referring to something else, which deals with mission, which deals with programs, the intangibles that you referred to. Could you just spend a few minutes thinking out loud about what that means and what is relevant to how an executive director should be thinking about how to capture that?
So again, the theory comes from a portfolio management, and if you were investing in stocks, you would look at individual stocks and compare their asset value, how much that stock is worth versus how much you have to pay for it. They don't actually calculate, return on income is one part of how you would calculate that, but it is not the only thing. So the reporting and the audit and all the rest of it is necessary but not sufficient. Really what you're looking at is what is the value that you're creating for society, and then you're dividing it by the price that you had to pay for it. That's basically what a price to earnings ratio is, when you the PE ratio, if you've ever heard of that when you manage a stock, or what your stock price is. The stock price is the value that the company is producing divided by the share price of it. So what you're trying to do for yourselves is to take whatever your impact is, and let's say that the impact is we want to reduce literacy by 30% within our community. You want to be able to measure the reduction in literacy and divide it by the expense that you paid for that reduction.
Oh, that totally clears it up.
Oh, yeah.
No, it does, actually. It's very helpful, and we're going to get Stephen in. But the reason I wanted to play on this is, when you hear national speakers, sometimes they're bringing forward an innovation or a theory of change or a concept which may or may not apply. What Richard's talking about something is that applies to every single organization. And financial operations, increasing our financial literacy is absolutely essential. But there aren't a lot of effective sort of on-ramps for particularly grassroots organizations to grow in their capacity. So I did kind of want to camp on this because Richard's not presenting something that's sort of optional. It's really important for us to get clearer and sharper in our thinking. And we use a lot of different words, too, like social return on investment or the benefit to society. We talked about that yesterday as a distinction between for-profit and civil society organizations. So actually, it's really, really helpful what you're saying. And I know Steve wants to jump in on this as well.
Yeah. Richard and I have been talking about this for a long time. And Mary and I have been talking about this even longer. I mean, this is actually one of the key parts about Weekend in Boca. Do you remember yesterday how Lindsay said what kind of investor you are? That there's some that do it because of the relationships, and some that do it because of the impact, and some that do it, that kind of typology of the way that investors are. Well, think about how it is in this room, how all of the organizations here do something slightly differently. Return on marginal investment is also return on marginal impact. So if I have $100, right, or $1,000, and I really want to figure out what to do in terms of education, I'll bet you, check me if I'm wrong in this, but I'll bet you there's some folks in here that are working on after-school programs, enrichment programs, right? Then there's some folks here that are working on teacher empowerment. Then there are some folks here that are working on kind of figuring out the facilities empowerment, facilities enrichment. Each one of y'all is doing something slightly different that makes the whole system work better. And what we have been talking about for a while is, well, how do we connect the dots in terms of each individual part of the system starting to dialogue and come together, but so that people know, okay, you're the go-to for this part, and you're the go-to for that part. And how do you create it so that there's much better understanding of that? Because there are also different kinds of social investors in terms of people that, for example, there's some people that would choose to invest in helping 10 folks get through drug addiction individually. You know, like a real intense thing for 6 months, working with 10 folks on that thing. And there are other people who say, look, we ought to be investing in saying no to drugs and having like reaching 1 million people with just that message. So some people prefer breadth and extensive impact, and some people prefer deep engagement and intense impact, right? But a narrower thing. Is one of those better than the other? No, not necessarily. But what it is it's the crowd. It's like taking the part that resonates with the social investor and connecting it with the right kind of organization. So that's part of what Richard is getting at, and that's actually part of the reason why we want to do this, is kind of gel it together.
I'd like to connect his second point to his first one, and then did you want to weigh in more on that point, though?
Just one thing about to make this more practical. Rather than trying to worry about how to boil the ocean and figure out like how do we compare uncomparables like literacy to homelessness, just focus on and take on for a minute the idea that you could compare different projects within your own organization, different ways in which you might tackle whatever your mission is, and that really what you're trying to do is measure the relative impact and the relative investment in each of those individual projects, number one. Number two, don't worry that you have to solve this problem yourself. My other bigger point is bring in help. Bring in management experts from the private sector who know how to manage and measure in their own fields, and ask them to help you figure it out using their science.
That's where I was going to go on your skilled volunteerism point. So, but first, when you think about intangibles, or you think about impact, you think about your performance. Peter Drucker said there are some things you can measure, some things you simply have to just define. Another way of saying what Richard kind of framed earlier. But how clear are you on defining that? That's a evolutionary story. Things are always changing. You're growing or contracting. You're in new markets. You're relatively successful with these clients or not so much with others. So it's a discipline to just inherently build, and a good conversation either among your management team and or with your board, of course. There's something known as outcome-based evaluation. Perhaps you're familiar with that. If not, please become familiar, and you can at least do some online equipping. But it's a good way to be thinking about what targets exactly are we shooting at, and how do you create a language for the kinds of things that correspond tightly to your mission. But again, Richard's second point was talent, and he made reference to skilled volunteerism. It's a great frustration to those of us on this stage, and great burden to those of you trying to run mission-centered organizations, that talent comes to you at their lowest level. We bring oftentimes people to our board because we think they can raise money or they're passionate about our cause, and they typically just react to the executive director's reports, and meetings are kind of boring and nothing happens in between meetings. But they have this great skill set of problem solving and building your employees' talent and all these other functional skills like we're talking about here. What would it look like to either bring onto your board or to recruit at your local university a volunteer purposefully? So to be able to go to an academic again, or a consultant or a business leader, and lay out some of these issues, even in the form of questions. How can I get clearer on how to measure impact or think about impact? And how could I connect to the university to find some interns? Some of the recommendations that Richard made. If you're like me, I run a nonprofit organization, you hear something like that and you think, all right, that's on the to-do list, that's 22. And then there's this and this and this and this, because you own it.
Right.
And that's largely why you do so well in your job. You're passionate and you're good. Don't do that. Think about who can do that for you and who you can do that with. So on the innovation piece, just to wrap up this part, we'll wind the overview. You touched on a concept, but you didn't lay tracks for us. If I could ask you to a little bit more, because you said if we kind of keep doing what we're doing better and work harder, we'll have incremental change, but that innovation lies in the outliers. Well, that struck me as necessity. That'll pull you out sometimes because we're in a crisis, like a flood or something. We come together like we never have before. But what are other ways that more naturally you can build this outlier mentality without compromising the fact that you have a business to run and you have to keep
Right.
that rational.
Yep. A couple of thoughts on that. First of all, being very deliberate in how you engage with your board. I was talking with Robert earlier about how useless some boards can be. I'll just say it. And that oftentimes there's a lot of the Association of the American Society for Association Executives did a whole study on how on board engagement, and that a lot of times nonprofits rely on their boards as their source of innovation. And in fact, the reasons why people join boards is oftentimes completely unaligned and unrelated to the mission of the organization or the actual operations of it. And board members, if you were to, again, I say, look at the private sector. The private sector listens to its board, but it is one of many inputs that management takes. It is not the last word on the topic. Number two, and I'll give you a couple of practical things. One is, as I said, try to think about how you can bring multiple disciplines together. So mixing people up, even within your organization, to get them to look at problems differently. Bringing in outsiders is a great way to do it. Another way with outliers is to use prizes. This is a new kind of a new innovation that a number of the public sector has started to use a lot more of. It's to create innovation prizes where you say, okay, we're going to stake a certain amount of money and we'll give you not just the money for coming up with the solution, but we'll give you a lot of fame and credit within the community for having solved whatever the problem is. And the reason why prizes are important, or what's helpful about prizes, is that they give permission to that one outlier who might never have thought about your problem to think about it. Because the other problem with that deep reservoir of expertise is that people think to themselves, I'm an engineer, or I'm an accountant. What could I possibly know about solving literacy? But when you create a prize or you create a public contest for trying to solve that problem, it actually gives them permission to work on your problem.